In this lesson, I want to introduce you to one of the most powerful features of a Jest mock function, and that is its ability to track whether or not it's been invoked, as well as tracking the arguments that it has been invoked with. This is a functionality that is completely not available on a plain JavaScript function, but is baked into a Jest mock function by default. That's one of its primary advantages. So let's begin by cleaning up some of the code from the previous lesson. So I'm just going to remove this code right here. And we no longer have any asynchronous code either, so we can remove this async keyword right here. So where do we stand currently in the code? We have a single Jest mock function, and by default, it's going to return undefined because we did not specify any custom return value. And then on line number 4, we are invoking that function once and then console logging its return value, okay? Now, simply by invoking it once, this Jest mock function tracks that it has been called once. And we can actually write a Jest assertion to validate that that Jest mock function has been invoked. And that syntax looks like this. Here is where we make our assertion. As always, because we are in Jest, we start with the expect keyword and we invoke that function. And typically this is where we pass in our operation or our method call or our behavior, whatever we are testing or want to validate. In this case, I'm simply going to pass in directly the mock function, which we have referenced with my magic func. So I'm just going to pass in that complete mock function. And then there is an available assertion that we can call here that is called to have been called. And what this assertion will validate is that this mock function has been called, or in other words, that it has been invoked, that it has been executed or run at least once in the code since its creation. So if I save and I run, we're going to see that the test passes because we are indeed invoking that mock function at least once, and that is happening on line number 4. So check out what happens if I comment out line 4. At this point, the magic function or the mock function has not been invoked, and it is aware of this. So it tells us that the test will fail, right? It says, hey, I expected this number of calls, which is greater than or equal to 1. So Jest is expecting this mock function to have been invoked 1 or more times. That's what to have been called means, right? Instead, it's saying, I received an actual number of calls of 0. There was nowhere in the code since the creation of your mock function that it was invoked, all right? Though once again, this is a contrived example, but when our mock function is standing in for a real-world implementation, it can be super helpful. So just to, once again, get us thinking, in our app component, our component, when it mounts, will automatically run this logic, right? That's part of the rendering process of our app component. So you can imagine if we replace axios.get with our own mock function, we can track that get has been invoked correctly, for example, with the right URL, and after the component has been instantiated, because we're able to replace this functionality with a mock function, which can track calls to itself. And that can validate that component did mount is doing what it's supposed to do, right? This example is a little bit contrived because obviously we understand that we are invoking it on line number 4. But when something else is going to interact with our mock function, that's where this functionality can be super helpful. It can validate that that other piece of functionality is indeed talking to our mock function, which is a stand-in for a real functionality, all right? The other thing I want to show you, as I mentioned, is that this code can actually validate that we receive specific input arguments to our mock function. So for example, let's say I invoke my magic func with the argument of a string of A. It can be any arbitrary string argument or any argument whatsoever. Right here, we are simply validating that that function has been called, period. But there's another assertion that we could write called to have been called with, and that will not only validate that the mock function has been invoked, but also that it has been specifically invoked with a given argument. So for example, here I can validate that somewhere along the line, the mock function represented by my magic func was called specifically with the argument A. And you can see our test is passing right here. So in comparison, if I replace this right here with a string like B, we're going to get a failure, and Jest is going to tell us, hey, I expected your mock function to have been invoked with an argument of A, but all that I saw that it was invoked with was an argument of B, and there was a total of 1 mock function calls. So it's smart enough to not just realize, that we want to test whether my magic func has been invoked, but that it's been invoked with specific arguments. And it can get pretty smart here. So for example, if I say invoked with A, but right here I validate that it has been called with 2 arguments of A and B, it's going to say that's a failure because we say we expected it to be invoked with 2 sequential arguments, A and B, but when the code actually ran, it only received 1 argument of A. So it's going to care not just about the argument specifically, but all arguments and in the order in which they were expected. So Jest is pretty smart about validating that kind of logic, which can ensure that our mock function is being interacted with in the exact way that we expect, that it is getting the correct arguments in the correct order, etc. So I'm just going to move this code back to being a passing test. We are expecting an invocation with an argument of A. We are getting at some point an invocation with an argument of A. And that is the key takeaway of this lesson. This is the powerful feature from Jest mock functions. They are able to monitor themselves, to look inwards and to see how many times have I been invoked, with what arguments have I been invoked, etc. And especially when they are standing in for real world methods, this can be super advantageous. All right. So one more lesson that I want to show you in the very next one, we're going to talk about how we can mock out an existing library using another method called jest.mock. And after that, we're going to have all the tools that we need in order to write our app component test. So I will see you in the next lesson.